Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
I never thought a single mistake, a moment of carelessness, could upend an entire family, or rather, expose the cracks that were already there, just waiting for someone like me to pry them open. It started exactly 32 days before my cousin Mason's engagement party, a date I remember not because of the invitation or the family group chat blowing up with talk of flower arrangements and cocktail napkins, but because that's when I got a text from Mason that was very clearly not meant for me. I was folding laundry, the TV on low in the background, when my phone buzzed and lit up with his name. I figured it was something about the party, maybe a question about the guest list, or more likely, his usual last-minute plea for help buying a suit that didn't make him look like a high school prom date. But when I opened it, I stared at the message for a long 10 seconds before I even let my brain accept what I was reading. Last night was perfect. You looked so sexy in that black lace. Can't stop thinking about your hands on me. Same time tomorrow. I remember blinking, thinking maybe I was wrong, maybe it was a joke, or, and this is how deep denial runs in families, maybe it was meant for me, and he was just sending some stupid meme or teasing me about a friend. But no. There was a photo too, right underneath it. A blurry shot of a woman in lingerie, not even trying to hide her face. I felt a twist in my stomach, the kind that hits when you realize you've seen something you can't unsee. The kind that pulls your whole perception out from under you. I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, holding the phone like it was radioactive, and I kept thinking about Julia, his fiancée, how she'd always been kind to me, even when other girls in the family kept their distance. She sent me Christmas cards, remembered my birthday, once drove 40 minutes across town to drop off soup when I had the flu. And here I was, sitting in a room full of sunlight and clean clothes, holding a text that could shatter her world. I called Mason 2 hours later. I didn't even know what I was going to say until I heard his voice. Hey Rach, what's up? Like everything was normal. Like he hadn't just sent me digital evidence of his betrayal. I didn't even say hello. I just said, do you know who you just texted? And the pause that followed told me everything. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't denial. It was panic. Then came the weak attempt at damage control. Wait, that wasn't for you, obviously. Look, I'm gonna explain, it's complicated. But he never really did. He said they'd had problems. That Julia had changed over the last year. That this other woman got him in ways Julia didn't. And I don't know what I expected from him, maybe shame, maybe at least a shred of accountability, but instead, I got a long list of excuses and an even longer request to keep it between us. Just until the engagement, he said. After the party, I'll figure it out. Just, don't blow everything up. Not now. I was disgusted. But worse than that, I was conflicted. Because for all his faults, Mason and I had grown up almost like siblings. He was there the night my dad walked out. We built forts in the basement, shared snacks at Thanksgiving when our parents were fighting. I knew his tells, his patterns, his selfishness masked by charm, but I also remembered the kid who gave me his last slice of pizza and threatened to beat up the boy who made me cry in 7th grade. That's what makes betrayal worse when it comes from family. You don't just feel anger. You feel loss. Like a part of you has been broken off and sold to someone else. I should have gone to Julia right away. Should have handed her my phone and said, read this. Know who you're about to marry. But I didn't. I froze. I told myself I needed time. That maybe Mason would come clean on his own. That maybe he'd call it off. That maybe, just maybe, this wasn't my burden to carry. But guilt is like mold, it spreads in the dark, in the silence. And by the time the day of the engagement party rolled around, it had taken root in every corner of my chest. I wore a navy blue dress that day. One I bought specifically for the event, as if a new outfit could disguise the war going on inside me. The party was held in the backyard of a rented villa, big open space, string lights, those stupid Instagrammable drink stations with lemonade and infused vodka. Everyone was dressed like they'd been picked from a magazine ad for upper-middle-class happiness. Julia looked radiant, and I hate that word, I really do, but there's no better one. She had that look women get when they believe in their future. Like the path ahead is clear and straight and made just for them. She hugged me and said, I'm so glad you're here. I know things with the family have been weird. I nodded and smiled and hated myself a little more. It wasn't even an hour into the party when Denise, Mason's mother, my aunt, pulled me aside. She was wearing pearls. Actual pearls. And heels that sank into the lawn with every step, making her look like a cocktail waitress trying to balance on a trampoline. She smiled, the tight kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes, and leaned in so close I could smell her perfume. "Rachel," she said, "I'm only going to say this once. Keep your mouth shut about the other woman, not today." My stomach dropped. She knew. She knew, and she wasn't even pretending to be shocked or ashamed. She had the audacity to act like this was about manners, not morality. I wanted to ask her how long she'd known. I wanted to scream, "What the hell is wrong with you?" But instead, I just stared at her. And maybe that silence scared her, or maybe she thought she'd won, because she tapped my arm like we were sharing a secret and said, "Let's not ruin Julia's big day." So I didn't. I stood there, drink in hand, smile frozen in place, watching my cousin make a toast to new beginnings and old friends. I let the lie breathe. Let the air fill with it. Let Julia raise her glass, clinking with every person who should have protected her from this. And then, just when I thought I'd officially lost my spine, Julia placed her champagne flute on the table, cleared her throat, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Before we drink, I think it's only fair everyone sees what I found in Mason's phone." That was the moment. That was the shift. The air snapped like a rubber band. No music. No chatter. Just her voice, calm and deliberate, cutting through the party like a blade. And all I could think, as everyone froze in place, was this. She knew. She's known. This whole time. I think there's a certain kind of silence that lives only in families, the kind that doesn't feel peaceful or still, but rather weighted down with all the things nobody is saying, all the things that hang between you like ropes strung too tight across a room. And when my Aunt Denise looked me dead in the eye and told me, with a tone so syrupy it made my skin crawl, to keep my mouth shut about the other woman, I didn't just hear her voice. I heard every generation of secrets before us, every whispered betrayal tucked neatly under the dinner table, every time someone in this family decided that keeping up appearances mattered more than telling the truth. And I knew, in that exact moment, that this day was never going to end the way they all thought it would, no matter how many canapes were passed or how many flutes of champagne clinked together under those damn string lights. The hours leading up to that bomb Julia dropped were soaked in denial, not just mine, but everyone's. Because when people don't want to see the truth, they'll build entire realities to protect themselves from it. I watched Mason laugh with his friends, that too big, too perfect grin he used to flash when we were kids, and he wanted to get away with something, the kind of smile that makes you doubt your own instincts, that tells you maybe he is just that charming. Maybe you're the one who's bitter, who sees ghosts in mirrors. But I wasn't seeing ghosts. I had the damn text. I had the image. I had the knowledge that, while Julia had been dress shopping and scheduling fittings and FaceTiming her mom about flower arrangements, Mason had been sneaking out to God knows where to whisper sweet filth to a woman whose face he didn't even bother to crop out of the photo. And the worst part? When I confronted him after he sent me that message, and I say confronted, but really, it was more of a hesitant, almost embarrassed call, because I still couldn't believe what I'd seen. He didn't apologize, didn't panic, didn't even ask if I was going to tell Julia. Instead, he just sighed, like it was all some tedious inconvenience, and said, "Look, you know how relationships are. Things get stale. It's not like I don't love her." And then, as if that weren't enough to make me want to punch a hole in the wall, he added, "It's just sex, Ratch. Don't blow this out of proportion. You've never even been married, so maybe you don't get it." That one landed hard. Because in this family, the fact that I'm 38, single, no kids, no mortgage, and no man has always been treated like some sort of silent failing. Like I missed a turn everyone else took and now I'm wandering around some unspoken cul-de-sac of disappointment. So I didn't tell Julia. I didn't storm in and wave the phone in her face like a righteous crusader. Instead, I sat on it. Let it rot. I told myself I'd wait. That Mason would call it off. That maybe, and this is how delusional I'd become. Maybe the woman would get tired of him, or maybe Julia would find out on her own. But deep down, I knew that what I was really doing was protecting myself from the mess, from the guilt, from the confrontation that would surely turn the entire family against me, because that's how this clan works. It's not about who did what. It's about who exposed it. And the whistleblower? They're always the villain. Which is why, when Denise pulled me aside just before the toast, all pearls and fake elegance, and hissed those words, "Keep your mouth shut about the other woman," not today, I didn't respond. I just nodded, because arguing with Denise is like yelling at a wall made of money and Botox and generational entitlement. She didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't ask what it felt like to carry that weight around. She just wanted me quiet. And when she gave me that smug little pat on the arm, the way people do when they think they've outmaneuvered you, I felt something inside me click. Not rage, not yet, but something colder, something sharper, like the slow turn of a knife in the dark. But then Julia stood up. And everything shifted. She didn't look angry. That's what got me. She looked calm, composed, like she'd rehearsed every word and timed every beat. She picked up her glass, tapped it lightly, smiled at the crowd, and said, "Before we drink, I think it's only fair everyone sees what I found in Mason's phone." There it was, no drama, no tears, just a statement. Simple. Surgical. And in that moment, all the air got sucked out of the backyard. The laughter died. The music was still playing, but no one was hearing it. Even the caterer, who'd just been handing out shrimp skewers like it was any other Saturday, stopped mid-step like someone had frozen the frame. Mason, standing less than 10 feet from her, went pale, not white, not pink, but this strange, blotchy shade that looked like guilt and nausea had gotten together and had a baby. He opened his mouth, probably to lie, to deflect, to charm his way out, but Julia held up one hand, just a slight raise of her wrist, and he stopped. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't break down. She just unlocked her phone, pressed a button, and played the voice message loud enough for everyone to hear. "You were better than my fiancé last night. I still taste you. Don't make me wait so long next time." You could have heard a pin drop. Or a heart shatter. Or a reputation implode. Take your pick. Denise moved first, of course she did, trying to reach for the phone, saying something about context and private matters, but Julia just stepped back and stared her down, calm as ever. And me? I stood there with my heart jackhammering in my chest, realizing two things at once. First, that Julia hadn't been oblivious after all, and second, that she hadn't just discovered the truth. She'd planned this. She'd waited. Just like I had. But she'd chosen this moment, this perfect, public explosion, and now we were all standing in the blast radius. Then she turned and looked directly at me. Not Mason. Not Denise. Me. And in the clearest voice I'd ever heard from her, she asked, "You knew, didn't you?" Not accusing. Not crying. Just a quiet devastation that said everything. And right then, as 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me and the music kept playing like some cruel joke, I knew this wasn't about what Mason had done anymore. This was about what I hadn't. There is a kind of stillness that settles over a room when truth finally arrives, uninvited and unwanted, like a sudden winter gust that slams the door open and turns everyone's breath to fog. And in that moment, as Julia stood with her phone in her hand, calm and unmoving, while Mason gaped like a man watching his carefully built kingdom fall apart one stone at a time, I felt the temperature in the backyard drop, not in any physical sense, but emotionally, spiritually even, like the warmth that had been faked through forced smiles and polite conversation had been sucked out and replaced by raw exposure. Nobody knew what to say. No one even tried to say anything, because there was no salvaging what had just happened. The voice memo, Mason's voice, unmistakably his, soaked in lust and arrogance, and that same toxic entitlement that had always lived beneath his charm, was still echoing in the air, even after Julia's thumb had left the screen and the sound had stopped. For several long seconds, no one moved, and in that silence, I could feel the shift, not just in how people saw Mason, but in how they saw me, because when Julia turned to me and asked, "You knew, didn't you?" It was like she dropped a second grenade into the middle of the gathering, one aimed directly at my chest. Her voice wasn't angry or even hurt in the way you'd expect. It carried something quieter, something more terrifying: disappointment. And not just disappointment in Mason, but in me, someone she had trusted, someone she had believed was above the rest of the chaos that surrounded this family like a toxic fog. I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because everything I could have said would have either sounded like a lie or come out as the kind of truth that wounds more than it heals. And Julia, God help her, just nodded, as if my silence was the answer she'd been expecting, as if she'd already made peace with the idea that even the people who claimed to love her had chosen to leave her defenseless in front of the firing squad. She didn't cry, and that's what made it worse. If she'd screamed, if she'd thrown something, if she'd demanded to know why I hadn't warned her, I could have clung to the excuse of fear or loyalty or confusion. But she just nodded once, as if to say, "I see you now," and then she turned her gaze away from me as though I no longer mattered in the narrative that was unfolding. Mason tried to step forward, tried to speak, his voice cracking in that familiar, practiced way that always used to get him out of consequences, the "I messed up" tone, the "I'm only human" confession, the one he'd used on teachers, girlfriends, even cops, but no one bought it now. Not after hearing him say those words in that voice to that woman, knowing full well what they meant. Denise moved quickly, like a panicked mother bear, stepping between Mason and the crowd, her hands up as though she could physically block the judgment that was now pouring down on them like acid rain. "Let's all take a breath," she said, her voice trying for grace, but cracking with panic. "This isn't the place. Julia, sweetheart, we can talk about this in private. There's no need for theatrics." And that's when Julia finally lost her composure, not in a breakdown, but in a laugh, a short, dry thing, almost a cough, but unmistakably full of disbelief. "Theatrics," she repeated, blinking slowly. "You mean like throwing a party to celebrate a lie? Like asking your niece to keep her mouth shut about your son cheating and pretending everything's perfect? Is that the kind of theater you prefer, Denise?" No one stepped in. No one defended her. Because suddenly, the cracks in Denise's carefully managed facade were visible to everyone. For years, she had curated this image, the elegant matriarch, the woman who hosted, organized, soothed, and smiled, always with just enough frost beneath her words to keep people slightly afraid. But now, with her son exposed, her credibility shredded, and Julia staring her down like a woman who had finally decided to stop being polite, Denise looked almost small, like a queen without her crown, clutching pearls no one cared about anymore. I stood there, useless, frozen, my hands damp, my mouth dry, and all I could think about was how I had failed to do the one decent thing I could have done: warn her. Even if it would have torn the family in half, even if it would have made me the villain, even if it would have meant getting screamed at or disinvited or humiliated, at least it would have been honest. But I'd said nothing. And now, the shame of that silence was louder than anything I could have shouted in its place. Julia took one last look around the backyard, and then, in the most precise, deliberate motion I've ever seen from someone so publicly wronged, she placed the phone on the table next to the untouched champagne, adjusted the strap on her dress, and walked away. Not ran. Not stormed. Walked. Like a woman who had decided, finally and completely, that she owed this family nothing. Mason didn't follow her, though his body shifted like he wanted to. Denise reached out to grab his wrist, and he let her, which told me more about the dynamic between them than any holiday dinner ever had. The guests, cousins, in-laws, friends from college, some neighbors who probably just came for the food, all stayed frozen, as if waiting for someone to tell them how to react, how to behave, what side to stand on. And for a full minute, maybe more, no one said anything. That's when the whispers started. Quiet at first, like wind brushing through leaves, then sharper, louder, broken pieces of sentences. "Did you know? How long? Is that the same girl from? Why didn't she say something sooner?" Some of the eyes turned toward me, and I recognized the question in them, though no one asked it out loud. "Why didn't you warn her?" I wanted to say that I didn't know it would come to this. I wanted to say that I thought maybe Mason would fix it. I wanted to say that I was scared, that I didn't want to be the one to detonate the family's carefully constructed peace. But the truth, the real truth, is that part of me wanted Julia to find out on her own, because part of me wanted everyone else to see just how hollow it all was, how fragile the lies they lived in really were. Maybe I didn't want to be the one who started the fire, but I can't lie and say I wasn't curious what it would look like when it burned. And now, with the fire roaring and the guests choking on smoke, there was no going back. The silence was pure. But it wasn't peaceful. There's a moment, right after the collapse of a carefully maintained lie, when everyone in the room begins to look around not for truth, but for someone to blame, not necessarily the person who did the worst thing, but the person who dared to not prevent it, to not cover it fast enough, to not carry the weight of another's shame silently and without protest, and standing there in that backyard, with Julia's footsteps still echoing in my head and Mason frozen like a broken statue beside an untouched cake, I could feel the heat of accusation turning toward me in slow, inevitable waves. It wasn't loud at first, not even confrontational, but I saw it in their faces, the uncomfortable shifting, the looks passed between relatives who had spent years learning how to look without really seeing, and now, stripped of the luxury of ignorance, they began to grasp for the next person they could push into the fire to spare themselves the heat. Denise was the first to act, which didn't surprise me in the slightest. That woman could sense the changing tide of power in a room the way a shark smells blood in the water, and as soon as Julia disappeared beyond the gate, and the music finally cut off with an awkward click from some teenager at the speaker table, Denise turned toward me with a face that had been carefully reconstructed in those 30 seconds of silence, transforming from the gracious host to the calculating survivor, and her voice, though low and controlled, had that edge of fury that only comes when someone realizes their control has slipped and they need to rebuild it by force. "You knew," she said, not asked, but stated, as if my guilt was not in doubt but in how I would be punished. "You stood there, you smiled at her, and you knew." What kind of person does that? The irony of that question, coming from a woman who had looked me in the face just hours earlier and told me to keep my mouth shut about the other woman, burned so deep it made my vision blur for a second. And yet, somehow, she had twisted things in her head in record time, shifting the narrative so that her son was no longer the betrayer, but the victim of my supposed disloyalty, as if I had set the trap and not merely witnessed him walk into it. Eyes wide open and zipper down. I opened my mouth to respond, but I could already see the game unfolding behind her eyes, the subtle glances she exchanged with the older cousins, the tight smile she offered to the cluster of ants near the wine table. An entire strategy forming as naturally as breathing, because Denise had spent her entire life managing image and influence, and I had just threatened the ecosystem she ruled with a smile and a spreadsheet of Christmas card addresses. So I didn't bother with a defense, not really, because I knew I was never going to get one, not from her, not from Mason, and not from half the people here who were now more concerned with what the neighbors might say than the fact that Julia had walked away from the man she was supposed to marry with nothing but a phone and her dignity. Instead, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Don't you dare pretend like you're surprised. You told me not to say anything. You made your choice, Denise, and now you're going to live with it." That's when Mason finally found his voice, or at least something resembling it. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, his words slow and slurred as if his brain was struggling to catch up with the disaster unraveling around him. "I was going to end it. I just needed time. You didn't have to. You didn't have to stand there and let her do this." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the audacity of it all was so wildly disconnected from reality that it felt surreal, like I'd fallen into someone else's drama. "You needed time?" I repeated, loud enough for a few more heads to turn. "You've had months, Mason. Months to end it. Months to confess. Months to act like a man instead of a horny teenager with no impulse control. And you think I'm the problem because I didn't jump in front of the grenade you pulled the pin on." By now, the party had officially disintegrated into clumps of people whispering and checking their watches, pretending to need to head home early or check on the babysitter, as if the spectacle hadn't riveted them just minutes earlier. The embarrassment of being present for the implosion was now outweighing the drama, and self-preservation instincts were kicking in. But the family, our family, wasn't going anywhere. And as more of them turned their eyes toward me, I felt a very old bitterness rise up in my throat, one that I had swallowed again and again for decades, every time I was talked over, dismissed, or positioned as difficult, for having the audacity to call out hypocrisy. So I decided, right then and there, if I was going down in flames for not saving Julia, then I wasn't going alone. I turned toward Denise with a smile that wasn't kind, and in the kind of voice you save for conversations you know will be remembered for years, I said, "You think this is the worst thing your son has ever done? You think this is the first woman he's cheated on? Or did you forget what happened with Carly? Or with the bartender in Lake Tahoe? Because I haven't. And neither have you." The silence that followed was thicker than anything earlier that afternoon, and Denise's face, always carefully Botoxed into an expression of calm, twitched for the first time in years. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. And while we're pulling skeletons out of closets, I continued, my voice steady now, like I was just clearing out a storage unit. Maybe you want to tell everyone why your daughter stopped speaking to you in 2009. Or should I remind you how many years you spent pretending your husband's mistress was just a family friend who came to every barbecue? That was when Denise finally snapped. Her voice cracked like dry glass, and she lunged toward me, finger outstretched, shrieking something about me being ungrateful, disrespectful, a bitter old woman who didn't understand what loyalty meant. But she didn't finish the sentence. Because that's when my brother, standing at the edge of the crowd with his jaw clenched and his eyes dark, stepped forward and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe it's time someone else in this family learned what betrayal really feels like." And in that second, I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. I had said what needed to be said, not for Julia, not even for Mason or Denise, but for me. Because sometimes the only way to survive a family built on lies is to burn it to the ground and see who's left standing once the smoke clears. And I was still standing. But I wasn't done. Not yet. There's a peculiar calm that settles over the wreckage of a family once the final brick has fallen, not the kind of peace that follows healing or understanding, but a different kind entirely, one built on exhaustion, scorched bridges, and the undeniable clarity that comes only after the last pretense has been shattered and the masks are no longer necessary because everyone has already seen each other for who they truly are. In the days that followed the engagement party implosion, I kept expecting to feel something resembling closure, or at the very least some sense of justice having been served, as though exposing Mason and calling Denise out in front of everyone would stitch something shut inside me, but instead, I found myself drifting through a strange emotional no-man's land, where the adrenaline had burned off, and all that remained was the cold, lingering ache of reality. No one called to check on me. No one sent a text to ask if I was okay. There were no apologies, no follow-ups, no late-night confessions from guilt-ridden cousins who suddenly saw the light. The family, as I should have predicted, closed ranks with the speed and efficiency of a political machine, not necessarily because they believed in Mason's innocence or Denise's excuses, but because the unspoken rule in our bloodline had always been that the bigger sin is not the betrayal itself, but the breaking of the illusion. And I had broken it. Publicly. Loudly. Unforgivably. Julia, on the other hand, vanished in the most admirable way possible, not hiding, not begging for pity, but simply removing herself from the narrative. She deleted all the photos, deactivated her accounts, and according to my brother, who heard from someone who worked with one of her friends, took a job offer in Chicago and moved within the week. No messy goodbyes. No dramatic declarations. Just a clean cut from the cancer. And while part of me admired her strength, another part was haunted by the way she had looked at me before walking away, not with hatred or even anger, but with something quieter and heavier, the recognition of shared failure. She had expected me to protect her. I hadn't. And that kind of disappointment doesn't scream, it just lingers, in the corners of your mind, in the pauses of your day, in the dreams that wake you with the taste of guilt still in your mouth. But it was Denise who stayed with me the most, whose face I kept seeing not in memories of better times, because let's be honest, we'd never really had them, but in those moments when I would pass a mirror or hear my own voice say something too sharp, too cold. And I'd realize just how much of her had seeped into me over the years. I told myself I hated her, and I did, but I also knew that our hatred came from proximity, from shared traits we both refused to admit existed. She was power-hungry, manipulative, fiercely loyal to the wrong people for the wrong reasons, and somewhere, buried under all my righteous indignation, so was I. That's probably why, when I came across that old family camcorder in my closet, the one I had shoved there after clearing out my parents' garage 2 summers ago, something dark and deliberate sparked inside me. I hadn't intended revenge. Not at first. I wasn't looking for it. But when I found the tapes inside, dusty and faded, and popped one into the old converter out of nothing but curiosity, I knew within minutes that I had found my answer. The footage was from the summer of 1998. I remembered that summer well. The heat, the endless cookouts, the way Denise had strutted around in that leopard print swimsuit like she owned the entire world, and as I watched the grainy images flicker to life, I found myself frozen, drink in hand. As the camera panned across the pool and caught something I hadn't remembered clearly as a child, but now saw with unmistakable clarity, Denise, drunk and giggling, sitting far too close to her sister's husband, laughing at something he whispered. In her ear, her hand resting casually on his thigh, her mouth moving in a way that could only be described as suggestive. It wasn't graphic. It wasn't illegal. But it was clear. Clear enough to ruin her. I should have turned it off. Should have walked away, told myself that I had already done enough damage. But some part of me, the part that remembered her fingers digging into my arm at the engagement party, the part that recalled every time she had weaponized silence and shame to get what she wanted, refused to let it go. She had controlled the narrative for decades, rewritten family history to cast herself as the perfect matriarch while everyone else danced to her tune. And now I had something that could silence her in ways she would never recover from. So I digitized it. Cleaned up the audio. Added captions, not to mislead, but to clarify timestamps, names, the date burned into the corner like a receipt from fate. Then I uploaded it as an unlisted video, sent the link to my brother, and told him we were having a brunch for closure. I rented a small private room at a downtown restaurant, invited only the core family, Denise, Mason, 2 of our uncles, and a handful of cousins who had been particularly vocal after the engagement party, questioning my motives, whispering accusations at family dinners. They all came. They always did when Denise called. She walked in first, as if nothing had happened, wearing sunglasses indoors, greeting the waiter by name, telling Mason to sit up straight. She didn't even acknowledge me until the food arrived. But I didn't wait for her permission. I stood, pulled out my phone, and cast the video to the flat screen at the back of the room. No introduction. No speech. Just the image of Denise, younger and bolder, giggling at a married man like no one was watching. At first, they didn't understand what they were seeing. But within 30 seconds, the air had shifted. Denise stood, told me to turn it off. I didn't. Mason swore under his breath. The cousins sat frozen. No one said a word. When it ended, I said only this: "Now we're even." She stormed out. Mason followed. No one else touched their food. Julia never responded to the link I sent her, but the next day, I got a message from an unknown number that simply said, "You didn't have to do that. But thank you." And yet, even as I stood in my quiet apartment that night, phone in hand, TV off, wine untouched, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd done didn't feel like victory, not really. It felt more like inheritance, like I'd been handed the same weapon Denise had wielded for years and, in using it, confirmed what I had spent my whole life trying not to become. Because in the end, I didn't just destroy a lie. I inherited it.